Hi everyone, welcome to the latest episode of the EFL Magazine podcast. Today's guest is Frank Foley. Frank has spent 33 years in Japan. His career began at News Corporation, where he spent 17 years. He led sales at HarperCollins and launched the Fox channel in Japan. At National Geographic, he played a key role in National Geographic Learning. He later moved to character licensing at HIT Entertainment, overseeing brands like Thomas & Friends and Guinness World Records. Currently, he's the Japan country manager for the East India Company Ltd.
Hey everyone, buckle up for a new episode of the EFL Magazine Business Podcast, the one and only podcast made to help you launch your business or take your existing business to a level of success you could never have imagined. Whether you're a school owner, freelancer, publisher, or other entrepreneur, you're sure to pick up lots of actionable advice when you listen to the EFL Magazine Business Podcast. Remember to visit eflmagazine.com for great articles and features. Without further ado, here's your host, the founder of EFL Magazine, Philip Pound.
Hi everyone, welcome back to the latest episode of the EFL Magazine podcast. And today's guest is Frank Foley, and Frank is a country manager of family-oriented entertainment brands. Is that the right way to say it, Frank? I can re-edit this if you want. Yeah.
No, that's absolutely fine. And firstly, thanks for having me on, Philip. I was a regular listener when you were doing these before, and I'm delighted to hear you're back up and running and doing more episodes.
Thanks. It's always great to get feedback. So I just want to kind of go back to the beginning, Frank. Where are you from originally? Yep. Well, we kind of know, but just tell me a little bit about your background.
Well, I was born in Cork in Ireland. My family moved to Australia when I was 14. So I finished school and went to university in Brisbane in Australia. And that's where I started. I did Japanese at Griffith University in Brisbane. Came up here as an exchange student in the very early 80s. Went back and forward a little bit after that, but ended up moving back to Japan for work in 89. And apart from 2 years in Singapore, I've been in Japan ever since then. So in total, about 33, 34 years in Japan.
Wow. I think I may have mentioned this in a few other podcasts, but not everybody is as loyal listener as you. So you landed back in Japan in 89. So obviously the bust happened around then. Wasn't it 89 to 91 kind of time?
Yeah. I mean, my memories of that time are the strong yen. At the time, Australia seemed ridiculously cheap because the yen was so strong. And Japan was, at the time, one of the most expensive countries in the world. So the interesting thing for me is how things have changed, how they're reversed. Now Australia, I mean, I couldn't go back to Australia. I probably couldn't go back to Ireland because you couldn't afford to on a Japanese salary. So how the world changes.
Absolutely. I just went back home actually last month, and it's just the money just evaporated on the journey over. Yeah, it's tough. And also, there's other problems. I mean, it's encouraging more people to come in here, and over tourism obviously is a problem, as we've been seeing, not just in Japan, but there've been a lot of protests. I think in Greece, isn't there? I think I've been reading that Tenerife gets like 16 million visitors every year for such a small island. So have you noticed any of that in your job or in your travels in Japan?
Absolutely. Well, I live in Kamakura. So to go from 1980 when I came here first to present day in a flash, we've lived in Kamakura for the last 20 years. My wife's family is from down there. And yes, the tourism, I mean, well before COVID, it quietened down obviously during COVID, but now it's back to probably more than before. And the crowds are ridiculous in Kamakura now. Yeah.
It really is. You see it a little bit in Tokyo as well, but it's, it's a curate's egg, isn't it? It's like it's good for some, good for some, and bad for some. Environment bad, economy good. Local culture maybe diluted, or maybe fabricated just for tourists. So that's how it is. But tell
Yeah.
me a little bit about moving to Australia. By the way, you don't have much of an Australian accent. You didn't really
I
pick up.
don't.
Yeah.
Well, I moved to Australia at a time when Ireland, so it was the mid-70s. Ireland traditionally, as you know, was like the butt of all the jokes in the world. And it was just around the time when Ireland was starting to become trendy. Music started to get overseas, and to be Irish music was popular overseas, and so it was sort of became a positive for me to be Irish. I had a better chance of finding a girlfriend and stuff like that. The things you're thinking of that are important to you when you're a teenager. So I think maybe it was my age. I was 14, and the accent was sort of baked in. But I think I made a decision as well to stick with the accent, and might help me.
You hammed it up a little bit.
Well, I joke that I used to go home after school and have Irish accent lessons with my mother, to keep it up. But
yeah, it's amazing, really, and that's probably a good explanation, because you often see the opposite, don't you? I know I had a cousin who moved to London in probably the 80s now, if I remember. And he came back after like a few months, and he was a Cockney almost. That's that's where it goes. So you came to Japan, and sometimes I've been here for about 14 years myself. But when you come to Japan, there's a kind of honeymoon period, isn't there? You're here and you're like, oh wow, look at the vending machines, look at this, the jingles and the color, and things are so different. Do you still have that feeling about Japan? Has it worn off? What still fascinates you about this country?
Well, I came to Japan as a student of Japanese. I was an exchange student, so I came with a purpose. I came with a certain amount of understanding. There were a lot of Japanese students at my university, and they'd have sort of parties, and we'd all cook Japanese food together and everything. So I was, I knew a fair amount. I remember the biggest surprise to me when I got here was, I think in my mind I had mixed up Tokyo and Singapore, and I had this thing in my mind that Japan was all modern, and it was like the Jetsons. And then arrived here, and you go to a university here, and I mean, it's just, this is like early 80s. You can imagine what the buildings look like. So that was the biggest shock, is that I had this image of a modern country and got here, and it wasn't. But that was sort of comforting as well, because it made it less different. Ireland isn't a really modern country. Brisbane was a big country town at the time. That was probably the main sort of surprise when I got here. Probably the thing that is still the same today, that still surprises me, and it's what you talk about with so many of your guests, is the low level of English language competence. I mean, that basically hasn't changed, has it? Not enormously. It's a bit better, but.
Yeah, not enormously, but I know some people who've been here since the 70s, and I don't know if this was your experience at that time, but there were no English signs in the subways in Tokyo in the late 70s. I don't know, was that like that when you arrived?
There was no English at all. I mean, obviously there was no internet. I still wrote letters, handwritten letters back to my family. That's how we communicated. Telephones were ridiculously expensive, so it was very different. You were cut out. It was a much more immersive Japanese experience back in those days, for sure.
That reminds me, being a student in England in the 80s, my mother would post over £5 every week to me in the post, and I think at this time it was about 94, 95. So it was the punt, the Irish pound, and the pound sterling were at parity almost. So she'd go to the bank, and and she'd hand in the £5 and she'd get the sterling just straight back, and then she'd put it in and write a little note. But of course, now living away from home, we have WhatsApp and all these. It's just a complete sea change, isn't it?
It is. I mean, life is so easy these days. It really is.
Yeah, but when it's easy, it brings further challenges, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah. that's the thing. So let's get on a little bit to your. I want to talk about your work history here. Sorry, it sounds like a job interview we're doing here, but I just see you started out with HarperCollins in '89, Tokyo and Singapore. So you led a 10-person team. Okay, I'm not going to read out your bio here, but tell me about your first position.
Well, what led to that is I ended up working at the Australian National University in Canberra, and my job there was publications officer. So I had experience in publishing and sort of production management for publishing, I suppose. But I wanted to go back to Japan, and the head of the research center at the time was very supportive, and he, in various ways, sort of helped me to get a job in Tokyo with HarperCollins through some introductions. So I started working for News Corporation in Tokyo in 1989, running first Japan and later on Asia Pacific for their largely ELT business, some trade publishing as well, but largely ELT sales. Around that time, HarperCollins bought Scott Forsman, which I'm sure doesn't even exist anymore, but that was a big college publisher. So we started selling more in the rest of Asia than in Japan, but selling into the universities as well. That was my first experience. I met John back in those days. My last 2 years with that stint with HarperCollins, because I rejoined them several years later. My last 2 years were in the mid 90s. Was down in Singapore, and that's where I met John Lowe, who introduced us.
Yeah, John, who's introduced many of the guests, Adam, I know, and of course Barry, who I had on a couple of episodes ago. So John Lowe is a man in the know. Sorry, the unintentional rhyme there, but and thanks again to John for that. So working for News International. So the big question: you were working for them. Did you meet the man himself?
Yes, yeah. For it was News Corporation was the time.
News Corporation. Yeah,
News International would be the English side of it in those days, I think.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yes, but later on. So what happened was within News Corporation, Murdoch at one point decided to sell his educational publishing business to Addison Wesley at the time, and then, as you probably know, that was all wrapped up with Longman and Pearson. Now Pearson owns everything in the whole world. So I, at that time, within News Corporation, had the opportunity to move over to their cable and satellite business. Murdoch had just bought the remaining shares in Star TV in Hong Kong, and was looking at launching Star TV in Japan. Soon after that, those plans sort of changed. He met Masayoshi Son, and they decided to launch what they call J-Sky B, so the Japanese version of B-Sky B, which quickly morphed into Sky Perfect TV, that's still around today. So I was drawn into all of that, seconded from News Corporation into the Sky Perfect business, in sports mostly. And they were great days, and we did. Murdoch is, he was that type, and especially back in those days, he really project managed new ventures pretty closely in the early days. So, for a year, possibly more, he was here regularly, and as were his sons as well, Lachlan and James.
Hey, I heard, I can't remember, but in one of the many books about Murdoch, but he said that if Murdoch was to sit down with any business owner for 1 minute, he would give you advice that would make your company hugely successful. Have you heard that about him before, or had you experienced that, like his advice being invaluable for?
Well, he's certainly. I mean, I was, a fly on the wall, or in Japanese, a kabanmochi for most of these things. I was not involved in any decisions. I was doing a lot of listening. And yes, it is. I mean, to see people operate at that level, it's an education. Yeah.
Yeah. So you were working there for from almost 10 years. Wow. And so how about the changes at that time in broadcasting? Because as you mentioned, it's just kind of coming back. And of course, I've got a deficit of knowledge here, but I still remember Star TV in Asia, and then of course there was the amalgamation of like Sky and British Sky Broadcasting wasn't there. And nowadays, of course, satellite dishes are becoming what a thing of the past, aren't they? It's become like set-top boxes, isn't it?
Yeah.
And Apple like devices, Apple TV like devices that very similar. The Sky one looks very similar actually to Apple TV. So, can you tell me about the evolution and what's happening now and where you see the future for broadcasting?
Well, it's when I think of those days when this is like around the late 90s, early 2000s, the equivalent of what's happened now with streaming was digital broadcasting, the switch from analog broadcasting to digital, and there was it was just like a land grab for transponder capacity, and engineers were the most important people in your company because they were the only ones who understood how to get a picture through on these digital in these digital systems. But it was great fun. I mean, the best time I had was I was out for a time there before Sky Perfect, when Star TV was launching their own channels here, and we launched the first digital channel in Japan from Star TV. And I was selling that channel to cable operators all over Japan. And I got to go over, from the length and breadth of Japan, maybe 3 times selling cable. And the wonderful thing about cable is that they're built in areas, where they can't get a terrestrial signal in. So they're in the mountains and in beautiful areas. That's probably one of the best jobs I've ever had, was a free travel around Japan, selling cable channels. So that was the world then, was the shift from analog to digital. And, that was still all about protecting the old way of selling content out of a Hollywood, dominated market. And that was all about protecting windows where they'd step the content through. They put it out in theatrical first, and then pay TV, and then DVD, and then somewhere way down at the end of a terrestrial TV, got the privilege of paying millions of dollars for Hollywood movies later on. So right up until recently, they were able to protect that. But the big change with streaming is that streaming, and to be honest, with VPN, I mean, how do you protect your content when, I can sit here and I can watch RTE through my VPN? So it's, technology has just changed the world, and, really, I mean, the old Hollywood system has broken down. Entertainment is now owned by the big tech companies more than it's Amazon and Netflix, and they're trying to come back. I have friends of mine who are much more knowledgeable in this area, who come from Hollywood and know what's happening. But Disney has done a good job with its Disney Plus service, and HBO is trying to do things and everything. So it's still in a little bit of movement, and still to an extent in a state of flux, but completely different from 20 years ago, or completely different 10 years ago.
Yeah, it sounds a little bit like the LCC model, isn't it? Disrupting the incumbents, wasn't it? I think Ryanair came in, and then British Airways had to adapt and start doing away with meals. So it's but they find it difficult to rebalance, don't they, to adjust to the new model.
But you start to see something similar to what was happening before, and there will be a set number of them that will survive, and they'll each have their character, and they'll sort of what type of content you're going to get from them. The other great thing I think is out of all of this is you're getting so much more international content. You can even on something as traditional as Netflix, you can watch shows from all over the world and all sorts of genres and everything. So I think we're spoiled. As viewers, we're totally spoiled with the content.
That actually reminds me that I don't know if you were in UK, Ireland at the time, but used to be a TV show. He's actually still going. Chris Tarrant on UK.
Oh,
He was
yeah,
on ITV. He had Tarrant on TV, didn't he? If you
yeah,
remember,
yeah,
you
yeah,
the listeners can see it on
yeah,
YouTube. And the crazy Japanese game shows. There was one called
yeah, yeah,
Endurance where they had to
yeah.
put a helmet,
That-
fill up with beer, and ride a donkey and
yeah,
not go to the toilet. So this was a fascination, but now, as you say, all these things are accessible on Netflix, aren't they?
yeah,
It's much
yeah,
more, balanced. The world is flatter there, isn't it? For
yeah,
in as regards that.
yeah.
But also, I remember actually it's coming back, and there's been a recent redo of Shogun. But if you remember
Yes,
Shogun in the 80s, the original Richard Chamberlain and
yeah.
RTE at the time was saying we have the European premiere of
Mm,
Shogun. That was how it was done, wasn't it? It was phased out in different
yeah,
countries.
yeah,
Mm. Uh,
yeah. I've actually, Shogun is really what brought me to Japan.
oh,
I was at university at Griffith and not particularly interested in what I was studying. I had a job in a pub and sort of was more interested in doing that than studying. And then I read the Shogun. So it had come out. So I started university in '79. It was pretty odd, a couple of years or so. But when I read it, and I thought, I want to go to this country. And so that's when I buckled down and started studying Japanese and got on an exchange program. And sort of the rest is history, as they say. So that novel is very close to my heart. But there's so many people like me of my generation that we were influenced by the Shogun, and we just wanted to go read the book, want to see the country.
wow. Yeah, I remember when it came out, was it 82, 83, the mini series, and
Yeah,
going to school the next day after the decapitation scene, isn't there? This and saying to your friends, "Oh, did you see?" I was only like what 7 or 8 at the time. Did you see that? And
yeah.
it was great talking point. But the novel itself is quite meaty, isn't it? It's quite a
Oh,
big
yeah,
book. Yeah,
yeah,
if I
yeah,
remember seeing it back in the
yeah.
80s. Yeah. Um,
So that in a sort of a full circle type of way, I was jumping way ahead to the present day again in terms of my career here in Japan. Is I'm now working. I'm consulting for 2 or 3 companies at the moment. One of them is the East India Company.
oh,
And for Japan, the East India Company, sort of in latter centuries, in China and India and everything, has a very different history. But in Japan, they arrived in Japan as a trading company. It was very early days for them. They were established in 1600, and they came to Japan in 1613. They with William Adams, Miura Anjin
the
in Japanese.
mm,
He was
the
their
the
interpreter.
the guy, the Shogun. He was, yeah.
So they went and they exchanged gifts with Ieyasu, and it's so that's the other. Obviously William Adams is John Blackthorne in the Shogun, so there's that connection as well. But I've really, as I've been working with the East India Company and thinking back on the novel The Shogun as well, and just realizing how important a time that was, because Ieyasu is sitting there and he's just pulled the country together after hundreds of years of civil war. He needs to trade, so he has to have some contact with the outside. Until the English and the Dutch came, the only alternative was the Portuguese and the Spanish, who were hell-bent on converting people to Catholicism, among other things. And so the Brits coming along at that, to the British East India Company, come along at that time, setting up trade and diplomatic relations between England, and there's still not Great Britain at that stage, but England and Japan. That gave Ieyasu a really important brick in building, what lasted for the Tokugawa era, that lasted for 260 years, whatever, after that. If that hadn't happened, I wonder what Japan would look like today if the British East India Company didn't come to Japan at that time, and if William Adams wasn't there to facilitate the introduction. It's I think, a fascinating time in Japanese history, and and I've ended up working for the East India Company after all these years, an Irishman working for the British East India Company.
Yeah, I know. It's well, it wouldn't be the first, would it? Actually, it's a fascinating book I read recently on Clive and
Right, right.
Plassey, and his character was
Yeah,
a complex individual. Probably actually reading it, and according to the author, had severe bipolar, and some
All
of
right.
his decisions and later life actually
Yeah.
bear that
Yeah.
out. But definitely,
Mm.
one I can recommend. I'll put in the show notes. I can't remember the name of the book. Sorry,
Right.
but you're so you talked a little bit there about the traditional publishing, and of course broadcasting, and how
Mm.
things have changed with streaming and technology and the world. But I want to go a little bit on to Hit Entertainment. So you were
Mm.
working there as leading children's entertainer, brand owner, and producer. And when I saw Pingu, I immediately felt a little bit warm there. Although Pingu obviously is living in a ice in a glacier or something. But tell me about working for that company.
That was a really fun job. A colleague of mine from Fox was recruited by Hit Entertainment to head up international like licensing for the Thomas the Tank Engine and Pingu, Bob the Builder brands. And he gave me a shout and said, I need someone in Japan. Would you like to come over? And what really interested me about that was, until that time, I had worked with foreign brands that were very well known overseas, but not in Japan. And so much of your job was to try and educate the Japanese consumer about your brand. Thomas the Tank Engine was the first one that I ever worked with, and the first brand that I worked with, that everyone in Japan already knew it. And it just makes it a completely different job. So I just jumped at the opportunity and had great fun doing that. And I, to be honest, I'd still be doing that today if the company hadn't been. It was bought by Mattel, by a much bigger company, and they already had a great team here in Japan. So I was excess to requirements in the end. But honestly, it's a job I'd still be doing if I could.
Yeah, so they were familiar with Thomas and Friends, Bob the Builder, and Pingu, but Bob the Builder would be a little bit later, wouldn't it? If I know, it's like
it's well, yeah. I mean, Thomas is dates back to the 40s, but as a TV driven licensed product, they're I think both about the same. But Bob was that was in the other category of where your job is trying to educate consumers, and that was a tough one. But thanks to Fuji TV, started broadcasting Thomas the Tank Engine in the mid 80s, and that's what gained the popularity. So I was my job was easy in that sense. I came in later on, and all we had to do was license the brand to as many toy companies and apparel companies, and anything you could think of that worked for the brand.
So your expertise is, market entry into Japan, and this is something I wanted to talk about. It's famously difficult. I may have mentioned on other podcasts as well, and just to give some of the examples, I think it was at Burger King. They came and then they left and came back, and Boots Chemist as well. Tesco. I found actually in the next stop to mine, I found about 10 years ago, a Tesco shop, but there was probably Tesco ketchup. There was the only thing. Everything else was miso soup and Pocari Sweat. But it's difficulty. So for a company looking to enter into the Japanese market, what do they need to know first?
That's a very interesting question. I wrote a book during COVID. As with many people, if I wasn't listening to podcasts, I was trying to think, well, what am I going to do today for the early days in COVID when for consulting it really slowed down. So I, with a friend, we worked on a book on just those sorts of questions. It's called Stories from the Gemba. And it was me and my friend and colleague David Pinsker talking to people with similar backgrounds to us, foreigners in Japan who speak Japanese, who've run businesses here for a long time, understand Japan, understand Japanese consumers, and talking to them about what is it, what do you need to know to really succeed in Japan. And the book is sort of unabashedly it's an argument for why people like us should be people who have been in Japan and understand the market, should be employed and rewarded to run companies here, rather than just sending someone out like they did in the old days from head office, and they stay for 3 years, and the staff just sort of sits around and waits until they go, because they know that they're not going to be here for a very long time. So the types of things that people talked about was, so one common thing that came through, and something I believe myself as well, is that you have to, you got to do your research. You got to obviously understand the market as you would anywhere else. You got to understand your consumer. But on top of that, probably more than other places, is you have to have an enormous amount of patience and perseverance. Do not just sort of leave or change people after, change your leadership after 2 or 3 years or whatever, just because it isn't going the way it should be. It often takes, twice, 3 times, even longer to get something done in Japan, because so much of it is about, proving your concept, obviously, but winning over the trust of the people that you want to work with, showing them that you are committed and that you are going to be around in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time. And, once you earn those credentials, and then it's finally, okay, let's do it, you're going to be here for a long time and you're going to succeed. So those companies, and I actually give those examples in my book as well, of, companies like Burger King and Boots, and Carrefour was another one, they came in and they just didn't get it right. Walmart, was it Walmart? Tried to come in with Seiyu and wanted to change all the widths of the aisles and all that. They just wanted to do everything like in America, and they failed. But that's not because it's difficult for foreign companies to succeed. It's that there's a way of doing it, and it's the way that McDonald's did it properly. They understood the Japanese consumer. They knew where they were going to fit into, or how to fit in to the lifestyle of a Japanese consumer. Starbucks did it. Starbucks is probably more popular and successful in Japan than any other market in the world. And they come in and they have a rule of no smoking. At a time when Japan was still very, very smoke-filled country. And they succeeded, but they succeeded by getting it right, by getting their customer service right, but their staff training, just the whole vibe that they have in the place. They figured it out. They had a strategy. They stuck to that strategy, and I think that's the big thing is stick with it. Understand the consumer, do all the work you need to do there, get great partners, win their trust, stick with them through thick and thin. One of the best things you can do. This is a pretty terrible analogy, and you can cut this from the interview if you like. But no one wanted a presidential candidate in America to be killed, obviously, but being wounded in the way he was, and getting those photographs, through the media, having that sort of a shock, can be the best thing that can happen to you in terms of trying to succeed on some sort of goal. It's the same in business. When I was running the Thomas the Tank Engine business, there was a huge problem with a global licensee making die-cast toys, trains for Thomas the Tank Engine, and there was a problem with an excessive level of lead in the paint, and that meant a massive recall. I mean, obviously there wasn't no actual real danger to kids, but having lead in paint with something that a child might put in their mouth, is obviously a big deal. With our partner here in Japan, Sony Creative, there was a big recall of the product and a huge public relations thing that went on and everything. But, we stuck with Sony Creative. They did an incredible job, but we also stuck with them, and we supported them in every way we could. And just going through something like that, it really wins trust. And, those relationships, I still have them today. And there are other people I interviewed for the book, and they tell similar stories. If you haven't had Alan Malcolm on your podcast, you should have in the future, because he's got a beautiful story along those lines.
Okay, you mentioned something interesting about recalls, and there's a good way to do a recall and very bad way. or many bad ways to do it, and maybe one good way. But how, if you were to do a bad recall as regards PR and transparency, how would you do it?
You'd go legal. In the West, it's very common to be very, very careful to avoid acknowledging any sort of for apologizing for something, because implied in that is some form of some type of responsibility for the problem. And they're very careful legally in what they say and what they issue and everything. I mean, Japan is not like that. If you are Hit Entertainment, it doesn't matter that it was a completely different company that made these toys and a company in China that was put the lead-laden ink on these toys. That doesn't matter to the consumer. We are, and Sony Creative was the representative of Thomas the Tank Engine in Japan. So you just got to say sorry. You got to take responsibility. So not doing that is exactly the wrong way to do it. And there've been some famous cases. Remember with the lift accident, wasn't there, when the CEO of the foreign company sort of went legal like that, and it just went completely wrong. So yeah, that's how you do it wrong, is going legal and not bowing and saying sorry.
Yeah, the solemn bow. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't say that you're responsible. It just says that, as the representative of the whatever caused the problem, that's what you got to do.
Okay, fascinating. So I want to move on. You mentioned your book already. So tell me about, you already mentioned that it was lockdown. You were kind of twiddling your thumbs a little bit, looking for things to do. So tell me about, you obviously have a collated stories from different people, and you have a co-author as well. So tell me about the process of coming up with the idea, producing the book, bringing together the whole editing process. If you've been you'd obviously been familiar with this through publishing, and perhaps some tips for people who are looking at doing something similar.
Right. So the original sort of idea or motivation to do it was during COVID, when all of podcasts, Clubhouse, we couldn't go outside, so we were listening, or like I am now being interviewed on them, or with you interviewing people. So I didn't realize how many interesting people there were in Japan. I knew my friends, I knew people within the industries I'd worked within, but there were people from other parts of Japan, people from completely different industries that I never knew anything about. One of the people I interviewed in the book, Harold Godso, is a Canadian lawyer here in Japan who's absolutely totally bilingual and also has a degree in computer science and philosophy, I think, as well as law and this sort of thing. He was one of the people that I came across through podcasts and stuff online, and got to talk to him and interview him for the book. So I thought it was just great, all these people who'd come out of the woodwork because of COVID, and came on these different platforms. And I thought, well, I'll just sort of try and capture some of these stories. And the stories that I was after is, I believe strongly in the value that people like me and people I interviewed for the book, what I call Japan Insider country managers. I've spent my entire working life in Japan. If I have a weakness, it's that I have never worked really outside of Japan, but I've worked here, and you just know a lot of things, and you just do, you don't do the wrong thing, I suppose, is the main thing. You just do it naturally, and I thought, well, let's try and capture some of these stories. So the first third of the book is myself and David wrote about our own experience and what we think. And then 2/3 is interviews with 12 or 13 people with similar backgrounds. And some great stories come out of it. I mean, I'm not trying to sell books here, but,
Please do. Yeah, I'm not. Yes, please plug a book. That's why people come on podcasts, and traditionally that was why people went on talk shows, wasn't it? They to bring out the book, do the rounds. So perhaps you might, if you off the top of your head, like to give us maybe some story from the book to kind of tantalize the listeners here.
It's there's so many. And what sort of topic? Give me a topic, because there's just so many.
Business in Japan, entry into Japan, maybe cultural misunderstandings, some maybe anecdotes about.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you. I'll give you a different one, because you've just sort of, as you were talking there, I just thought of how things have moved on a little bit. In that, I think the world has moved on from the old expats type of culture, and I think people like me are being are valued more and are finding great jobs here. Now, I think the next step might be, and I sort of touch on this in the book, is the next people who have to be trained a little bit more is the managers of country managers, the international manager sitting back in New York or in London. So something that came through in a lot of the interviews, and something I've come across 2 or 3 times in my life, is that you're at the mercy of your boss back in New York or London or Sydney or wherever it is. And your disadvantage is that you are far away from head office. You've got some sort of a network back there, but not a really strong network, certainly not as strong as theirs. You probably don't have a direct line to the CEO. So whatever the CEO knows about you is what they're hearing from the international manager. There's that part of it. And then the other part is the job that this international manager is doing is very different, or manager of international, or director of international, whatever they're called. It's a very difficult job, because you're managing people who in their own market are the leaders. And from your customers in Japan point of view, Frank Foley is the representative of this company. And you got to make sure that you position your local person well, and you support them, and you support them in every way you can in terms of managing the team here and managing partners and all that. And that's not an easy job, because they're probably covering 4, 5, 10 more territories, and trying to manage all those people is quite a difficult thing. So I think that's sort of where I ended my own section in the book, was this is probably the next thing, is really to pay a bit more attention to how the head of international in large corporations are chosen and trained, because the truth is that it's often a step to something, a bigger job, a domestic job in many cases, rather than sort of a job where you really have someone who understands how to manage in different cultures and how to manage senior managers at a distance.
Okay. Yeah, I think I read somewhere that the foreign Japanese workforce, it currently is like 3%, but by the end of the century it'll be 10%. So I mean, we won't be around here to see that, but that's what they're projecting. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Guinness World Records, global business development. So as we all know, Guinness Book of Records, and I used to buy them every year. Maybe get them for Christmas presents. I remember 85 have one, and 86 they had the annual, don't they? And was it Ross McWhirter, wasn't it? He used to do the TV show on was it BBC or ITV, one of those. And so we used to get, it was the only way to get information pre-Google, wasn't it? What was the biggest, the longest, the fastest, whatever. So you managed a transition there from basically publishing. So tell me about that, about your time.
The reason I ended up working for Guinness World Records is it was owned by the same group as Thomas the Tank Engine. So after Thomas was bought by Mattel, I then shifted over to focus on Guinness World Records full time. So when we looked at the Japanese market, the book sells incredibly well, even today, in countries where you have a Christmas gift giving tradition. And it's probably the same at your house, but like in our house in Cork, the book just appeared. It wasn't actually a present for anyone. It was just there. It was just, you always got it every year. And so that's great. And that still lives on today in those markets. But for, the non-Christian, how many was it, 2/3 of the world? I can't remember. That doesn't exist, including in Japan. So we had to come up with another business model. And like Thomas the Tank Engine, Guinness World Records is known by everyone. People, it's It's an adjective in Japanese. They talk about something being Guinness Q, so Guinness level. It means it's amazing. It's the best in its category. So everybody knows about Guinness Sekai Kiroku, but how do you monetize it? So the other thing we realized is that people, they wanted the opportunity to challenge. They didn't just want to watch Usain Bolt or sort of people eating most number of hamburgers in New York or whatever. They wanted to actually participate. So we came up then with the idea of working with sponsors to do events to allow anyone to challenge a Guinness World Record. So pretty the best example is in Tokyo was Tokyo Midtown have a big park out the back, as you probably know. And they had an event, they still have it, I think, in spring called Open the Park. And this Open the Park is a really big deal for them because it's what distinguishes them from Roppongi Hills up the road, because they don't have that open area. So what we did is we came up with a challenge festival that went for a whole week, set up like a matsuri. So challenges that they would typically come up with, would find, we didn't have goldfish. We had sort of a little plastic thing in there, and the most number of people who could collect that. We also came up with challenges that we wanted to, challenges that little kids or grandparents, right through to grandparents could challenge, and males, females, anything. So we had those sort of matsuri type challenges. We had a few sort of eco-friendly challenges, most number of, you have to rip off the label and take off the cap on a PET bottle before you throw it away here. The most number of sort of ripping those off in a minute. We had things like folding T-shirts, which was, job skill if you're working for Uniqlo is folding T-shirts really quickly. So we came up with this sort of Matsuri-based sponsored event, an interactive sort of participatory type event. So that was the change we made. And we also, along the same lines, we worked with some companies on using Guinness World Records in their marketing campaigns. The biggest one was the Evolta battery, which has the Guinness World Record for the longest AAA dry cell battery. But like a battery itself is really boring. So Hakuhodo was the agency working on it, and the creatives over there came up with the idea of designing this cute little robot who was powered by the battery. And they had the robot climbing the Grand Canyon and racing around Le Mans and doing triathlons and everything. And they based their campaigns on that. The robot didn't actually have any records. It was the battery inside that had the records, but that allowed them to get that message across. So it's coming up with those sorts of ideas of, outside the book of building the business.
I've seen that ad. I remember, is it the little yellow ladder and there's a fireman climbing?
Well,
he's the one?
I sort of look like a fireman. He's a blue and sort of gold.
Maybe it's, something like that. It's been a while since I've seen it. Yeah. That's a famous ad.
Yeah. And we sort of took that idea back to Thomas the Tank Engine as well, where we had the Guinness World Records challenge was for the longest plastic rail, setup in the world. We did it up at Thomas Land in Fuji-Q Highlands. And Thomas was powered by the battery, by the same battery as well. So, it was just coming up with ideas like that, where it wasn't sort of in your face, really, really over the top commercial type events and everything. But, you got to involve companies that will pay for sponsorship to do these events. And I think we did it in a fairly tasteful way. And it was also, Guinness is still, with sort of some exceptions that come up every once in a while, but they are very strict about keeping the adjudication side and that commercial side separate, and the record adjudication side of it is protected, and they're very, very, very serious about that. But within those bounds, we were still able to organize events and campaigns, and that's how the business succeeds today, not the book in Japan.
So speaking of books, can you tell me a little bit about National Geographic graded readers?
So, John Lowe, who introduced us, as we mentioned earlier on, John was working for a company called Cengage, and I was working for National Geographic Channel here in Japan. And John told me about a series that Cengage had done, was one of David Noonan's series, and they had VCDs, I think they're called, the low resolution DVDs, packaged in every student book with CNN content that they had like worked into the lessons. And some of the CNN content I'm sure was really interesting and everything, but not all of it could be. And I said to John, I said, look, National Geographic has this massive archive of videos and images and text that, why don't we think about using that? And work on something with Cengage. So John organized for a group of editors who were based down in Singapore, the Cengage editors. I don't know if you know Chris Wenger. He was one of the people that John got involved. So Chris and his colleagues came up from Hong Kong, and I had the producers, the on-air promo producers at Fox National Geographic here. They just created a reel to showcase the content. And it just worked. The editors thought, wow, why didn't we think of this before? And so they went back down to Singapore, and I let everyone know, National Geographic back in Washington, what we were doing and everything. So we seeded that idea. What happened, as often happens in companies that are siloed, and National Geographic in those days was a very siloed company, is that I was told, go back to your business of making a channel. You're not in the ELT business, give that to someone else. So someone in New York and in Washington took that over, and then they worked with the people at Cengage. But eventually they came out with the graded readers, that really were a game changer in ELT generally, but certainly in the graded reader genre. And it's starting, like John has sort of kept me informed about how that's been going over the years, but it became such a big business that Cengage ended up buying it from National Geographic, and it's now, I think, National Geographic Learning, I think is what they call it within Cengage. And it's one of their most important assets there. And it all came from, I'm not sure if there was beer involved, but it all was certainly a back of the envelope thing between me and John. And then, great work by my producers at National Geographic here in Japan to sell the archive. And it's, it's this, I think it's like in the hundreds of millions of dollars now, the value of the company. It's a huge thing. It's probably, in my career, it's the biggest idea that I came up with John. We came up with it together. It's unfortunate I couldn't go all the way through with it and have part of it later on. But it only exists because amazing people came along later in the process and actually created this content. All John and I did was come up with the idea and take it to a certain point. But I've chased that ever since and tried to replicate it. I mean, John and I we've done another couple of things along the line. One, we did a big series, an ELT series, using Bob the Builder with a publisher in Wuhan, of all places. But that was they they had a 6-part series with all based on Bob the Builder. So I think there's a lot more sort of potential for that branded content, and what it all gets back to is. We talked about motivation earlier on. But you got to be motivated about things. Like why Japan, why Japanese people still the level of English here, why it's so low. It's not because Japanese people are incapable of learning English. It's that they basically don't need to. I mean, my own people around me and kids around me, of my own and friends. Everything works in Japan. You don't have to speak English to have a great life in Japan. So what's the motivation? So. One way of getting people engaged and motivated is by giving them content that's actually interesting, and I think that's why the National Geographic idea worked. Is the content is really, really fun and engaging.
Yeah, anybody who studies National Geographic books, feedback from students, they love them, don't they? The pictures, the text, the topics, just it's so interesting. Can be like about the eye or about the rainforest or flooding in Bangladesh, whatever it is. It's just so varied and yeah.
So what I gave you there, Philip, I think it was the first time, it was an exclusive, worldwide exclusive of where the actual idea for National Geographic readers came from myself and John Lowe. Because most people don't, they've either forgotten it or they didn't know in the first place. That's where it started, but that's where it came from.
Yeah, and I'm glad we got to mention John as well, which was an added bonus. So let's come on. So that was your previous position, but now your next big thing, KK.
Yeah.
And I'll just read a little bit. We specialize in kids consumer brands and educational properties, including Japan market entry. So tell me a little bit about your current position.
My focus for the last 3 years or so has been on just finding interesting brands, interesting business ideas to work with interesting brands. So for me, I talked about the East India Company earlier on. That sort of falls into that category. Is it just everyone goes to China and to India and all of that sort of thing, and that's true and it's real and that actually happened. But there are other elements to that brand that are very, very interesting and very, very positive. So that was the thing that drew me to it is the company is owned by an Indian family now, an Indian entrepreneur, Sanjeev Mehta, and he's really he's gone back to looking at the original blends, the original blend for what's now called Earl Grey tea, using the ingredients that the Chinese tea blenders were using. And theirs is the only Earl Grey blend in the world that does that, so it's different from all of the others. The stories behind, they've got a blend called Royal Breakfast, which is the blend that Catherine of Braganza drank and popularized tea in the court and then what that turned into afternoon tea turned into women exchanging ideas and realizing they had something to say, and that turned into them getting the vote finally in the early 20th century. So tea and society and tea and culture, I just find all these stories really, really fascinating. And so we're launching that business. We'll haven't made it public yet, but there'll be something happening towards the end of the year that bringing that business back in Japan in a very visual way. The other main company I'm working with at the moment is, this is more about the idea and the need for it in Japan. It's a company that deals with online anti-counterfeiting. So they, put simply, they can tackle the problem with counterfeiters from various countries, but most of it is from China, selling through platforms like Amazon and Walmart and eBay, selling counterfeit product to American consumers. So they might be selling Hello Kitty T-shirts or Tamagotchi, or they're ripping off, they're stealing from the legitimate IP holders. So this company goes after those counterfeiters and retrieves money and then basically splits that money with the legitimate IP holder. So I'm working with them at the moment, and there's a huge need for it in Japan. Obviously with the popularity of anime, manga, Japanese pop culture generally, there's a lot of counterfeiting happening out there, and a lot of Japanese companies that need help in dealing with it.
Never more needed. So if people want to get in contact with you, Frank, what's the best way? I know you're on LinkedIn. Yeah.
I think LinkedIn. That's the best way.
And some other guests, they have separate accounts for kind of more, let's say, avocational, more about their hobbies or their pursuits outside work. Do you have anything like that, like a Facebook account or Instagram that you say? Yeah,
Facebook. Yeah.
Share all those things. Well, great. Frank, it's been really great talking to you today, and thanks again.
Likewise. Thanks very much for the chance to talk.
Thanks for listening to the EFL Magazine Business Podcast with Philip Pound. For more great advice and resources, check out eflmagazine.com. If you found this podcast helpful, be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. See you next time.